This presentation aims to signpost the concepts of memory and identity across two different case studies. That the city of Rochester and the port and market town of Faversham. I hope to demonstrate an understanding of memory and place in relation to maps, wills and depositions. My aim is to show how identity is embedded in different ways in the written, the illustrated and oral histories of the memory of the people, with a focus on the concept of time out of mind as remembrance across different jurisdictions. The paper raises questions over how memory is not just a monument of knowledge, but is constructed through the negotiation of the histories of lived and lost social experience. The concept of immemorial has its earliest known use in the adjective, as an adjective in the late 1500s. Time immemorial is a phase which signifies that which is beyond memory or out of mind. On screen is this map by Goodsall, which provides an illustrated map of the oyster fisheries on the North Kent coast. The map represents a sense of place for the fisheries of North Kent, which are located from Rochester to the left of the image, to Whitstable on the right, approximately 13 miles between each other. What lies between the ancient city of Rochester and the port of Whitstable are the map locations of the oyster fisheries, which at one time or another had prospered as maritime communities in terms of agriculture, trade and fishing. The map is also useful in understanding the geography of the North Kent coast in relation to representational mapping of the Medway, the Swale, the Isle of Sheppey, all linked as gateways to the sea. Goodsall is also constructing an imaginative memory, a narrative or purposeful curating of the oyster fisheries past for their present circumstances. This interplay of pragmatism and memory is also encountered in the typographical map and recognising the arrangements around the familial places. This acts as a way of mapping the world, how people and places were related, and in turn preserved the memory of the institution, its property, and the people who were its benefactors. In this case, a history of the North Kent oyster fisheries. I believe this is a map from Hasted. I may have got it wrong if anybody wants to correct me, but I'm sure I located it online rather than going to the first edition. But its title is a View of the Castle and Bridge at Rochester. It's a representation of the city from the 18th century. It signifies the state in the form of the bridge, the crown in the form of the castle, and the cathedral to the right of the image. It is the juxtaposition of the castle, bridge and cathedral which are symbolic in the formation and narrative of Rochester. Interestingly, the cathedral is missing from the title of this print. Queen Elizabeth was no stranger to understanding Rochester Bridge as a symbolic construction of the traffic and politics of Kent. This recognition leads to the commission of structural improvements to the bridge to the sum of £2,000 to stop its imminent collapse. The reformation of Rochester Bridge, prompted by the Elizabethan statutes of 1576 and 1585, had finally established effective administration of the bridge. The traffic of Rochester Bridge signposted the importance of the city in early modern England as a trade route and the road to Canterbury and Dover. It is situated at a crossroads between the land and the sea, a memory embedded with an early modern landscape which was highly political for the Elizabethan government. Rochester's maritime community in the reign of Elizabeth also underwent a survey, as did several places in the county, where there were any boats and shipping. In Rochester, the survey found there were 144 houses, 7 ships and boats, a civic and port authority, 4 quays, and that there were persons occupied in merchandise and fishing. This contrasts to the representation of the city on the screen to that image. The survey itself presents a lived experience, a representation of a maritime community, a sense of place and the culture of the city. The jurisdiction of Rochester Corporation extended from Hawkwood near Stodman to Sheerness. And from medieval times, time out of mind, there had been an oyster fishery in the Medway, free and common to all oyster fishermen. The mayor and citizens and their predecessors had held a court called the Admiralty Court for regulating and ordering the fishery. There is historical evidence that oyster and fishing grounds were organised by earlier medieval royal remit. As early as 1446, King Henry VI granted a royal charter to the bailiffs and citizens of the city of Rochester. Amongst the rights granted was the exclusive right to take fish, both great and small, and other things pertaining to regality, as former sovereigns had from the waters of the Medway, thus confirming and remembering these customs and traditions of the fishery. The Charter of Edward IV in 1461 recites that the citizens of Rochester had, time out of mind, been accustomed to elect a bailiff for the city, that the bailiff should be called mayor, and should hold all privileges, franchises and liberties contained in former charters, amongst them to have all wrecks of the sea and fish caught within the liberty. Thus the jurisdiction and boundaries of the fishing grounds become defined by institutional memory through the record of written document of the royal charters. Embodied within this concept of time out of mind is embedded an institutional jurisdictional right to the waterways and the fishing grounds, which one presumes defines the boundaries of these grounds, the rights to fish, and which also include oyster dredging. Time out of mind is a narrative, a memory of a tradition of the oral, meeting the written word which provides knowledge and context-bound activity of the maritime community of Rochester. Rochester's cathedral and bridge is also located by Simpson's map of Kent. It's of interest that the earlier Goth map in the late 14th century, the only bridge that's represented on that Goth map is Rochester Bridge, signifying its importance. Simpson's cartography places the city at the head of the Medway. Significantly, early modern Kent witnesses development of contemporary map making. A key agent in the mapping of Kent is Simpson's, and he had, he had much needed surveying and cartography skills. He was also paymaster for the bridge at Rochester and elected mayor of the city. Following early boundary disputes, the wardens of the Rochester Bridge Trust needed to establish firm ownership of the trust estates. In 1593, Simpson was paid £6, 13 shillings and 3p to consolidate the Bridge Trust estate. His map here is of interest because of the representation of Rochester in relation to place. We see the detail that is provided of Rochester in relation to the Medway as a gateway to the sea, a vital lifeline from the Weald to the North Kent coast and to London. The map provides space for an abundance of typographical details and has an accuracy in its representations, provided an encoded, illustrated memory of the landscape. These inscribed memories of Rochester signpost these questions. Why craft it? Who crafted the memory and for whom? Like Goodsall and Hasted, Simpson is constructing the landscape and social memory of place, yet social memory is also embedded in written documents such as probate wills. Wills, as a post-mortem gift-giving process, is an entry point to a range of representations of any community, both as collective and individual memories. Wills are written records, a memory of the past, a visualisation at a specific moment in time, and read and can be read as a version of biography. They are public documents. There are listed 10 mariners, 16 sailors, 1 fisherman in the Faversham wills from 1580 to 1640. Wills could be used for transmission of a broad range of assets. Property is often considered to be the principal component, either in the form of ownership or user rights, but heirs might also inherit tools and other productive capital following the death of the testator, providing evidence regarding the operation and interaction of the family or household with others within the local community. On screen, the will of Thomas Quick identifies him as a boat owner, a mariner, and likely to be a fisherman of Faversham. The assets which are being transferred are identified as property, that is the catchmonger, that's a dredger. The boat is called the Cock, and possibly there is shared ownership between his son Richard and his wife Joan. Women are underrepresented in wills of mariners, as are those from different social, economic and status groups. Nonetheless, wills remain valuable resources for the investigation of local inheritance practices, especially by those from occupational groups, as is the case with Faversham. The written testament is a record recorded memory of the identity of the maritime community in a lived experience. In this early Henrician map of Faversham, circa 1550, although someone recently debated the date with me on this, in this early map, what we see is Faversham itself, and you see this is a representation of Faversham Creek. As you can see in the middle of the image, we have quite a large crane, and you have some houses alongside the side of the creek itself. In this map, there is little attempt at scale or accuracy, but the map gives a general impression of the area and is the earliest extant depiction of Faversham. The iconic representation of the crane signifies an approximation of the wharf and merchants' and mariners' housing. In the contemporary Wardmote documents, more information is available to complete the picture of the port facilities in 16th century Faversham. In 1570, 2 repositories called the storehouses, 2 wharves and 1 crane called the crane with all their appurtenances, been in a certain street called Abbey Street, to the common way leading to the quay, and also of 1 repository, a storehouse called Archer's Well. Well, that written description seems to fit a pictorial description on the screen. This representation of this place of the maritime community in the town of Faversham can also be evidenced in the will of John Trouts, owner of the hoy called the Gift. He was a mariner, he was a fisherman. He not only left a substantial amount of money in his will, but also leaves storehouses, wharves and crane lying near the said quay at Faversham, possibly in location as the crane identified in the image. John Trouts lived at 25 Abbey Street, and he had an infrastructure to load and offload goods and trade. In addition, his will leaves other property to the daughter of another Faversham mariner, John Rye. Trout also leaves his legacy to his 4 nephews, who also appear as shipmasters and members of the Faversham Company of Fishermen and Dredgermen. Trout's position was enabled as a prominent member of the town community, and he generously bequeathed 3 properties to the mayor, jurats and commonalty of Faversham. This account provides a memory and identity, not just as a mariner and merchant, but as a person of special interest to the town of Faversham. Oyster disputes over the grounds in Faversham continue to this very day. The trade in oysters has been valued in the county of Kent for centuries. Such disputes over the ownership of grounds are not untypical. In early modern Kent, Faversham had 3 distinct oyster disputes over the oyster grounds from 1590s ongoing until the 1640s. The dispute of 1599 to 1608 led to the mapping of the oyster grounds and the creation of the 3 oyster maps. This is only a partial representation of those oyster maps, and this is, if you know, this is the swale that's been carved up. It's actually an estate map. It was the boundaries of the oyster grounds were written down after dispute, and local landowners would pay for this to be written up. The map is a product of 3 disputes. It's possible that the maps were drawn up as a result of depositions from the dispute and what was written down from memory, time out of mind. The caption accompanying the oyster maps tells us that the survey was made with a perambulation, literally a beat of the bounds, i.e. the grounds were walked. Local people were asked what the different elements of the grounds were. The oyster disputes are an example of a part of a civilising process in early modern communities, and an example of the symbolic community of Faversham, which was constructed by a set of legal disputes over the oyster grounds. There is in local organisation the underlying desire to inscribe perambulations in the written word rather than in memory, and this is a more fundamental meta-narrative about the changing relationships between the oral, the literate and the social circulation of local knowledge. This fiction should therefore be taken into account when considering any written sources, particularly local ones, as the nature of writing and written evidence served as reflections of social and cultural process. The Faversham oyster disputes were about property and land tenure, and changes of ownership may help to explain a number of disputes in the fisheries over the demarcation of boundaries and poaching at the end of the 16th century. It must also surely be true that the fisheries were highly profitable, because it seems to have been people's worth to take matters to court in spite of high legal costs. These cases are certainly invaluable to us because boundaries were confirmed and the rules and customs of the fisheries, which have probably prevailed time out of mind, are now for the first time written down. The phrase time out of mind links conceptually to the concept of memory, and though custom could be a source of profound conflict and disagreement, that idea that it organised local memory was locally shared. The process of recording and documenting the dispute is the memory, and it's encoded into the permanency of the written record. The depositions of the oyster dispute is of interest for my research because it demonstrates how the process becomes legitimised in relation to the rationalisation of the community as goal-orientated, rule-bound activity. The oyster maps represent both memory and identity through conflict and negotiation, signifying the past, remembered and forgotten. It is also about finding stability in the flux of oral performances in the nature of depositions. The oyster disputes in the following court case summed a number of witnesses through deposition in order to recall the true boundaries of the oyster grounds. Depositions are written verbatim copies of witness statements which will be available to both parties in the dispute. Depositions assist in the crafting of a narrative through testimony informed by a complex web of individual and shared perceptions. Analysis of these depositions potentially illustrates how meaning and knowledge are constructed within ordinary culture, and yet construct rule-bound activity, illustrate at different levels the construction of power relations through legal documents in relation to memory, locality and national influences. In analysis of these depositions, representation is formed through the cooperation and conflict within the community. At first, the plaintiffs are examined. For example, William Hayward of Harty, a yeoman, aged 67, knew the plaintiffs but not the defendants, and he did not know by custom the fishing grounds, and these belonged to the manor in time out of mind. He recognises that the said tenants paid yearly rent, and there was some controversy years before between Faversham and Whitstable, whereas John Bassett of Whitstable knew the plaintiffs and defendants. Bassett recognises there are boundaries to the fishing grounds, but does not know what these boundaries or limits are. A most fascinating deposition comes from Francis Gray of Orr, and he says that they of Milton have done so much damage to the tenants. They have taken 100 wash of oysters to the value of 8p per wash. He knew that the water bailiff of Faversham forbade the defendants from dredging the pollard, and these were named John Page, William Crux and Walter Summers, being of Milton. John Page swore he would kill or be killed before he would be taken, and he did threaten to resist and hurt him or them, which led him to being forbidden from the grounds. These appear to be the most transgressive acts of this case, that is theft and a verbal threat, but not the focus of the case, which are over rights of ownership and transgression of boundaries. The phrase time out of mind links to the concept of memory. I've attempted to show how the phrase is interrelated with identity, and this demonstrates its usefulness in understanding not just a representational history of place, but also a lived experience as a social memory. The depositions of the oyster disputes are of interest because they demonstrate how process becomes legitimised in relation to the community. Community's knowledge about the past was of vital political importance, embedded within the process of negotiation. This was true, for instance, when it came to proving local grazing rights and common land, parish boundaries, the level of tithes, or the limits to signorial power, and indeed oyster disputes. If they were to stand any chance in courts of law, communities needed to mobilise collective knowledge about the past, in short, through the memory of the people. Corporate groups would back up legal and political claims with reference to documents and charters as well as witness statements. It is therefore quite possible that we do not always recognise memories of loss for what they are, because they are expressed to us in ways that seem unfamiliar to us. What makes history of interest is the seeking of the extraordinary, the voice of the other in the writing of social history, and not derived from prescription, but a lived experience. A community's knowledge about the past was of political importance. Hopefully today I've been able to signpost and raise questions on the way that historians understand memory and identity, and that's premised on a range of document types and with reflection on the concept of time out of mind as a way of understanding locality and place. Themes present along the North Kent maritime communities, hitherto lost as voices in the archives. This echoes my previous sentiments and questions regarding the narrative of the memory. Why craft it? Who crafted the memory? And for whom? Thank you.
Let Jason grab a quick.
Thank you.
Always amazing, Jason. I love listening to you talk, and I have so many questions that I shall come back to you with at a later stage. I think that Jason really demonstrates the importance of written, oral history, how we question that, what that means and what that means in our communities. And I'm sure that's brought some questions, and I'm sure people will probably have some questions. And if you don't, I question whether you're listening carefully or not. So anyone want to start off with the first question? Oh, come on, you can't let me. I shall take chair's privilege then. So, curveball for you, Jason. In Medway, we talk about Strood and Rochester as distinct fishing communities in this sort of time period. In your record, I know you looked at Rochester and Faversham. Is there any Strood and Faversham, or does Rochester get, in the oyster disputes, just get amalgamated with Strood and it's just more of a Medway?
Thanks, Peter. Great question. What I've found is what's of interest and where the research is going is actually looking at the port books, which is the most interesting one in terms of the trade that's going on between Rochester and Faversham, Rochester and the continent. Not so much Strood in the port books.
Right.
And obviously the conflicts that are coming up are coming up as far as Milton and Rochester. The more I look into this with the research, the more connections there are. And it's like opening a sort of can of worms to think, actually, all of these maritime places are all very much connected. You know, they're not separate villages or towns. You know, the mariners from Rochester would have known the mariners from Strood. Likewise, those in Essex would come over as well to, as some would say, pillage the oyster beds of the North Kent community. And there was a lot of conflict over that as well.
Any other questions?
You say about the oyster bed being free to plunder, basically, but they had ownership. So if you went into that oyster bed and dredged up the oysters, they belonged to somebody.
Yep.
So that technically stepped in maritime theft. How did they prove ownership?
Well, I think the Faversham oyster map, for example, was an attempt to prove that ownership. They see it as land.
Yeah.
So oyster beds is on land, not the sea. And oyster beds themselves were claimed by landowners. So you can look all the way along that North Kent coast. If you go to smaller villages like Luddenham and Tenham, for example, and look at the wills of some of the families there, they're passing over oyster beds, so that it's really very much considered land. And it tied very much into the idea that it's also land that's been inned. So what we see is a reclamation of marshland, borderline agriculture, sea land, that's been developed and taken on board for agricultural use, for oyster beds and mussels, for example. So it's defined more as land than what it is sea. So although the oyster communities talk about an Admiralty court, it's not run by the Admiralty, it's actually more likely to be run by the local power elite in terms of that court, and you have to abide by that rules. What's interesting, I think, in my period is how those rules are formed. So we know for example, Rochester by Royal Charter has got a sense of rules that are there, but we know that also post 1540, post Reformation, Faversham loses its monastery. All its land's up for grab. I think one Thomas Arden grabbed most of it. But what you see is that land grab going on. Those great monasteries from Canterbury through Rochester, Faversham itself was grabbing, and all that land was then being given to local landowners itself. So it's just interesting how it then reformulated itself as a company. I mean, Rochester Oyster Company, if someone correct me, was not developed until early 18th century as a corporation. But its history goes on way before that. But it's finding the records, and one of the biggest challenges for me is being able to try and find those records either via the trust or through the local archives to find out, well, what was happening is the process. Because a lot of people think of oysters as being ordinary, as being cheap. They're not. There was a lot of money involved in oysters. And they're a part of a culture that spread throughout the whole of the country, not just around the coast, but we look at archaeological digs, we find oysters everywhere in this country, and it's about a culture which has been forgotten as well. But no means cheap, I don't think.
Looking at this connection between here in Jacobean and say the 18th century with the oystermen, the dredgers in the city of Rochester. In the electoral rolls, it looks as though there were times that the oystermen, the dredgermen, were the most frequent occupation, and some of them lived in other places, so that they were freemen of Rochester that living in through, for instance. What was the relationship, do you know? I mean, it's outside your what we talk about today, between that Rochester Oyster Company and those sort of masters, you know, of the dredgers who appeared in the electoral rolls.
I can't answer that for you, but I can provide a parallel example of what happened in Faversham.
Yeah.
Because the Faversham Free Company of Fishermen and Oystermen was simply another guise for Faversham's mariners and merchants.
Right.
Basically, through looking at the wills of these mariners and merchants in Faversham, what we find out, they're often masters of the ships. They're merchants that have got finance and capital via London. And because the whole of the Kent coast at that time is about shifting goods along the coast, what we see is that the mariners and merchants are using those boats not just for shipping merchandise, but they're also shipping oysters and fish as well. So they and it's seasonal as well, so they use those boats at different times. So yes, we do see in wills some boat owners that just bequeath a boat, for example. But there again, there are some in wills that I've seen that left fortunes of over £1,000. And that's a lot of money back in 1580 to have bequeathed. And they weren't just oyster fishermen, but they were using that trade on the back of their merchant activity. So it may be a possible way into looking at what those figures are saying. Yeah. Sorry.
That will be shown quite early on.
Yes.
So, the man who died, he left that boat to his wife.
Yes.
Did it say and his son?
There was a clause. I imagine that the son was not of the right age to take the boat on at this stage.
So is that why he left it to his wife?
He left security to his wife for his son to then take over.
So would she then have run that boat? Is that unusual?
I wouldn't have said she would run that boat at that stage. Although I do know there's a very interesting piece about a lady in Sandwich about 80 years later who did run a whole fleet of oyster and fishing boats, but out of Thanet, I'm afraid. Go on, Pete. Yep, might have.
I was going to say, I jumped in from my own research, Jason. There is quite good evidence, contrary to how people think, that when men died, they would leave the business to the woman, and the woman would run the business. The whole, how can I put this? You have to get beyond the Victorian understanding of the world to actually see the reality. But if you look back, if you climb over the wall of the Victorian period, and you look back and you get back into the 16th to the 17th century, you'll find that women were actually very, very powerful. I'm trying to think of the name of the guy, Peter Lasset. The World We've Lost, I think is the name of the book. and it's about family unit. And if you actually read his book, you'll realise that actually the woman was the most powerful person in the family. They run the accounts, they looked after the children, they cooked the food. Everything was done that these days we think are fairly normal or we take for granted was actually being done. So the woman's role was a lot more powerful. It's when you get to the Victorian period that you actually get this, what we tend to think of now. I'm not going to go into the debates with it, but in answer to your question and in answer to yourself, Jason, no, it's not unusual, and there is good documentary evidence for that period that women would have taken business on them.